Hey, if you're anything like me, then you totally enjoyed the new Guardians of the Galaxy movie. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I ran right out and bought my own $15 Star-Lord blaster toy just so I could turn it into this legit looking prop like it came right out of Chris Pratt's hands. And of course, I'm gonna show you how I did it. Hey, greetings there, fellow makers. Welcome down to my shop. I'm Bill, and today I'm going to show you how I transformed this cheap plastic toy into a totally legit looking movie prop. If you've been following my Star-Lord helmet kit painting series, then you know that I'm really excited about Guardians of the Galaxy, and I'm even more excited to have props from the movie, and that blaster is no exception. So grab your talking raccoon and your sentient tree man, and let's get to work. The toy I bought is the Rubie's Star-Lord blaster, and I got it on Amazon for 15 bucks. Links will be down in the description. I started by taking out all of the screws and carefully prying the two halves of the toy gun apart. I wanted this prop gun to have more realistic weight to it, so I grabbed some scrap steel threaded rod that I had laying around. This effectively doubled the weight of the gun. Those threaded rods were then hot glued inside one of the sides of the plastic gun shell. Next, I wanted to make the barrel match the movie prop, so I plotted out where I was going to cut it. Then I used a sanding bit on my rotary tool to chew away most of the material, and then I did a little bit cleanup work with the needle files. I also used those needle files to rough up the lip around the middle seam of both the gun halves. This was to help the glue adhere better when gluing the two back together. The decorative rivets on the side of the gun didn't really match the movie prop, so I used a countersink drill bit to drill a hole and to drill a little bit of a chamfer into the surface of the plastic. To glue everything together, I mixed up some of my favorite 5-minute epoxy. Once the two parts were mixed together, I brushed it into the seam on one half of the gun. Then I sandwiched the two parts back together. The screws were then reinserted to clamp it all closed. This helped hold the seam together while the glue cured. When that was all set, I could start cleaning up the slight gap between the two halves. I did a rough pass of cleanup work with the needle files, and then I started filling in the gap with an air drying spot putty. This was repeated all around the midline of the gun, leveling off both halves and filling in the seam. The gap in the rear circular bits was filled in using a thin piece of styrene plastic. I used a sharpened brass tube to cut out little plastic circles. Those circles were then glued into place, covering the gap. When the spot putty was all dry, I could start sanding everything smooth. I did most of this with some 220 grit sandpaper. To get rid of the screw holes, I mixed up some body filler. This is similar to Bondo. I used the filler to completely fill in the holes, and then I let it cure. When the filler was still a little bit pliable, I used a knife to cut away the bulk of the extra material. When it was fully cured, I used my needle files and some sandpaper to shape it down nice and flush with the surrounding plastic, totally obscuring those screw holes. I also removed the pesky text on the side of the toy in the same manner. There were some line details on the toy that weren't quite right, so I made a quick paper template and traced my new lines onto the surface of the gun. Slowly and methodically, I used a variety of shapes of those needle files that I love so much to start etching in the new lines into the soft toy plastic. This did take quite a while, and there is a little bit of a knack to it, so if you're not sure about this, practice on some scrap plastic before committing to your final part. When I was happy with how the new line turned out, I used more body filler to fill in the old line. The body filler was smeared into the offending detail and then sanded flush after curing. I also added another detail line across the top of the gun where the manufacturers neglected to add it, making it more accurate to the movie prop. Speaking of accuracy, on the movie prop there are some vent holes in the side of the gun that were not included in this toy, so I had to add them. I made a template first by taking a pencil rubbing of the area so that I knew exactly the dimensions I had to work with. Using my handy see-through ruler, I figured out where these new vent slots were gonna go, and then I used an awl to poke in some center points at the top and bottom of each of the 5 slots. I drilled holes through those points and then connected each pair using a small saw that I made from a piece of a scroll saw blade and an X-Acto knife handle. Those rough cut slots were then cleaned up using, you guessed it, more of those needle files. This was incredibly tedious, but I was incredibly happy with the results. Now it was finally time to paint this thing, so I started by roughing up the surface with more 220 grit sandpaper. I also hit it with some fine steel wool afterwards to smooth it up a little bit. Next, I masked off the handle I was planning on gluing something down to the handle, and I wanted to keep that plastic bare. After that, everything was hit with a normal rattle can primer and allowed to dry. The primer left everything kind of flat, so I went back over that with some more of that fine steel wool to shine it up a bit and add a kind of a brushed texture to the surface. For all of the bright metallic parts of the gun, I used Alclad's polished aluminum lacquer applied with my airbrush. This stuff looks really cool with that brushed texture in the primer. This layer was just slapped on all of the brighter silver areas without any masking. I didn't bother to mask because I would mask the next darker layer of paint. When that aluminum paint was all dry, I started doing my masking, including some tiny circles. I used a hole punch to make tiny masking tape circles, and then I placed them onto the chamfered circles that I drilled in earlier. The next layer of paint was another lacquer. This time it was Testor's gunmetal buffable metalizer. With all of the aluminum paint masked off, I could spray the darker paint on every exposed surface. After letting this lacquer dry for about 10 minutes, I used a paper towel to buff the finish and bring out a nice metallic shine. Then I could peel away all that masking tape, slowly showing the two different finishes below. To protect this finish, I used Testor's Metalizer sealer applied with my airbrush. This is a great clear finish that protects the lacquer and keeps that metallic shine nice and bright. After that was dry, I peeled away the tape that was covering the handle. The movie prop definitely has some kind of carbon fiber casting, so I picked up an adhesive-backed faux carbon fiber cloth. I cut out a large piece of this cloth and slowly started placing it on the complicated handle form. This took quite a bit of trial and error. The cloth does stretch a little bit, so it can conform to the grip to a certain extent. I pressed it into the inner edges where the grip meets the gun and then trimmed away the excess with a sharp knife. I also cut slots into the trigger and finger holes and folded the remaining flaps down and around the grip. This didn't totally cover all of the plastic below, so I had to cut long strips of cloth and carefully place them in and around the holes to finish up the coverage. Some of these spots just plain wouldn't stay down. The adhesive was a little bit weak, so I used a little bit of super glue to tack them in place. Overall, this was the most tedious part of the build, but in the end it looked pretty great. Then things went a little sideways. I really wanted this to have a glossy finish like the cast piece of carbon fiber from the movie prop, so I mixed up some EpoxAmite epoxy to laminate the faux carbon fiber cloth. I covered the surface and let it cure overnight. Unfortunately, it didn't quite get the effect I was going for. I think that because the cloth is really just a pressed faux finish and the epoxy didn't really soak in the way it would with real cloth, it just kind of sat on the surface. If I was gonna do this again, I'd skip that step. To finish the gun, I did a little bit of weathering. Now, it didn't need to look super dirty, but I did want to add just a touch of grime and contrast to the bare metal finish. So I attacked it with some brown and black acrylic paints, smearing them all over the gun and wiping most of it away with a wet paper towel. This was repeated over all of the crevices on the gun until I was happy with the level of contrast. A slightly dirty space blaster is much more believable than a perfectly clean one. I also brushed a bunch of that black paint inside the barrel where I could still see some bare orange plastic. While I was weathering it, I noticed a couple of faint spots of orange peeking through my metallic paint job. To touch these up, I used a chrome paint pen and carefully added just a dash of shine to those exposed edges. The last touch of weathering was the heat scorching at the end of the barrels. I started by masking off a couple of little chips on the tip of the barrels with some liquid latex. When that was dry, I airbrushed some flat black acrylic paint onto the end. This would simulate some charred soot. When that dried, I peeled away the latex, leaving some clean metallic chips behind. Then I used more of the Alclad Lacquers. These are their hot metal transparent paints to simulate heat-colored metal. I started with blue, slowly adding a thin paint in a couple of passes. Then I moved on to red, trying to blend it in with the blue. Finally, I finished it up with the yellow, again tapering it into the previous colors, and then tapering the edge into a nice gradient. That was the very last touch, and Star-Lord's epic blaster toy to prop conversion was completely done. This was a very fun and satisfying build. In fact, it's a great thing to get started with if you're looking to expand your airbrushing skills. And of course, if you're putting together a Star-Lord cosplay, well, this is the perfect piece to come in at a pretty low barrier to entry and make yourself an exceptional sidearm to accompany your costume. Hey gang, thanks so much for checking out our videos. This was a really fun build. I hope you give it a try. I'm really proud of how mine turned out, and it's gonna look great up on the wall next to the rest of my space guns. If you have any questions about this build in particular, let me know in the comments down below. I'll see if I can help you out. And of course, you can find out the rest of our prop and costume making goodness over on punishedprops.com. As always, all of the tools and materials that I used for this build, well, you can find them listed down in the description, and those are all Amazon affiliate links. If you use them to make your purchases, it helps our channel out a bit, and we thank you for doing so. And of course, if you try this build out yourself, I would love to see them. So you can tweet me pictures of that and any of your other prop and costume projects. I'm at Chinbeard. That's it for today. Thank you again so much for watching, and we will catch you all in the next build. Hey, thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you don't miss any of our new weekly prop and costume tutorial videos. For more goodies, head over to our website where you'll find blueprints, tutorial books, articles, and more. We also have a second channel for our Q&A show and extra behind the scenes videos. Thanks again, and happy crafting.